Hello, you're watching TVP World News. I'm Rewiński. We begin world talks, of course, and looking at the Hungarian elections. Hungarians are heading to the polls today in a potentially game-changing vote on who will be the country's next prime minister. After 16 years in power, controversial right-wing leader Viktor Orbán is facing an unprecedented challenge from his rival, Magyar, despite receiving backing from a variety of foreign leaders, including Donald Trump himself. With accusations of foreign meddling being traded by both sides, it's time to take a look at an update on the Hungarian elections. What is at stake? What's happening now? And what's next in line for Budapest? Joining us now is Maria Skóra, Associate Researcher at the Institute für Europäische Politik in Berlin. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, good morning, everybody.
So now the first exit polls are still many hours away, but we're receiving indications that from what we know so far, the turnout may actually break records. Can you tell us more about what to expect, and is it likely that indeed these elections will be viewed as potentially game-changing, and so more Hungarians than ever before will head to the polls?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think the possible scenarios for the outcome of this election will depend on, indeed, the turnout, expected high, even maybe more than 70%, and electoral decisions, because 20–25% of voters are still expected to be undecided. And as you said, it's a sort of unprecedented electoral landscape in Hungary, because there is a strong polarization and technically a duopoly. Complete domination of the political landscape by two camps, with Fidesz gaining estimated support of 40%, according to the pre-election polls, and TISA even reaching 50%. So imagine almost 90% of those who want to vote would vote for either of these two parties. There is little space for other political actors. There's a question if any of the parties will break the electoral threshold of 5%. And basically, it's a clash between these two big parties. And having said that, well, either of the results of this election will be very consequential for Hungary. So let's start with the first scenario, with a lower probability, according to the polls, that Viktor Orbán and Fidesz win. And my expectation would be that he would come back more prepared and more radical, if you want, to prevent a similar scenario in the future, to prevent a situation when his power is in such a volatile position. And I think it's important to highlight an important dimension of the prospect of this election. Then a very important aspect of it is the two-thirds in the parliament. So who will get the two-thirds in the parliament? Because two-thirds of mandates in the parliament is crucial to govern, to change the constitution, but also change the so-called cardinal laws. And should Viktor Orbán continue to be in power and win, of course, he will be facilitated by his system in place, the media, business, judiciary, and local government. So, as said, we can only expect the continuation. But
that would have, required supermajority to further entrench his power, right? The way you're saying. But it seems, based on the polls, unlikely that Viktor Orbán could achieve supermajority. He could still win this, and this is what I wanted to ask about. Like, do you think that there are any mechanisms, any ways in which these elections actually work, which could influence the result as we see it now? Because we're looking at the polls, we're seeing TISA firmly in the lead. But could these results be somehow distorted or simply come out very different from what the polls are telling us?
Well, there are different election polls, and polls are basically projecting two scenarios: either that TISA wins or that Fidesz wins, and pollsters closer to the government sort of lean towards this other position. Well, the electoral system in Hungary has been remodeled and redesigned since 2010. Many organizations highlight that there is an uneven playing field in campaign. And there is, first of all, a complex system of counting votes contributing to the numbers of seats in the parliament, individual party lists, proportional, and first past the post. We saw redrawing electoral districts, granting citizenship and voting rights to ethnic Hungarians abroad, like in Serbia, Romania, difficulty registering smaller parties with high thresholds for electoral coalitions, no limit on campaign spending, also for per candidate, also the electoral environment, the control, direct or indirect, of the media, gives Fidesz advantage. Using public resources to promote Fidesz gives advantage. This campaign is also sort of dystopian, because although we hear narratives and tools that were used also in other campaigns, this is an unprecedented use of AI, deepfakes, disinformation, deepfakes presenting events or people in a very realistic manner that never really happened. There are provocations, for example, with the attempted explosion or terrorist attack on gas pipeline in Serbia, providing Hungary with fuel. So this is a very difficult campaign, a very fierce campaign, and I think the scale of this campaign and the aggression in this campaign only shows how probable it is for Viktor Orbán to lose power and how determined he is to win these elections.
Now, you said that the pipeline story was likely a provocation. What evidence do we have so far?
Well, the evidence comes from different sources, and I think there are many events that has been happening in the last week, like the visit of J.D. Vance and many media reports, sex scandals, and so on. But I think the most important lesson in this elections is that it's actually the long-term performance of of Orbán's government that will affect voters' moods and voters' preferences. What I'm trying to say is that, of course, the campaign is very intense, and there has been, especially last week, has been very rich in different events. But I wouldn't focus on single events or single news stories that will determine this election. I think Viktor Orbán is very, very aware that economic recession that has been in place in Hungary for a few years is likely to cost him power. This is, in fact, how he came to power in 2010. And this has been going on for a while. So it's, again, the economy is stupid. Of course, it's also turbulent times that we live in. War in Ukraine, which, by the way, also has been very, very, very much instrumentalized in this campaign. Fear against war spreading in the European continent. There's negative sentiments spread among Hungarian society against sending weapons or to Ukraine or supporting Ukraine. So this is a very complex mix of factors that will feed into the final election result and perhaps will lead to a change of political leader in Hungary, and this announced or promised fresh start with Péter Magyar and TISA winning the election. Of course, the question is how big could the win be to govern and have the supermajority or not.
So now you've mentioned Ukraine, and Ukraine has been high on the agenda there. Now, do you think the Orbán government would be so desperate as to perhaps orchestrate some sort of false flag attack? Because we've had statements from the Serbian intelligence saying that the amount of explosives, basically, that was first actually stated by the Ukrainians, that would not have been enough to blow up the pipeline, at least not to cause significant damage. And later on, the Serbian intelligence also said, well, it's not really the case that this attack was really the work of the Ukrainians. But the Orbán government was trying to portray this as such and was vilifying Ukrainians on frequent occasions before that. We'd had the seized money story before that. Of course, the posters suggesting that they, meaning the European Union and President Zelensky, want to take over control of our country. Do you think that this is a tactic designed to deflect attention from the economic problems that you've just mentioned as well, meaning that the Fidesz party no longer controls the narrative on domestic issues, so it wants to perhaps take advantage of other issues, including especially foreign policy, in order to make up for the losses in terms of support?
Oh, I think absolutely. The Fidesz party has been campaigning on the promises of security, of stability, sovereignty, and this, I would guess, is a part of pushing this narrative. And on the one hand, maybe building this feeling of threat against the war, threats against foreign influence in the country, and portraying Viktor Orbán as the only person, the only leader who could save Hungary. You mentioned potential provocations. Some media reports also emerged talking about another idea of perhaps staging an assassination attempt on Viktor Orbán. Of course, I cannot assess how real that was or how true that was. I'm only talking about what some media were reporting about. So it only feeds into what we were, or supports what we were talking about, that this is a very, very fierce campaign, very, very intensive campaign, and it only, in a way, is a proof of how much is at stake, and in my view, how much Viktor Orbán really is determined and fears losing power, because Peter Magyar managed to build a movement which, for the first time in let's say since 2014, has a real capacity to challenge Viktor Orbán's government, despite his system being entrenched, being amalgamated in the party with the state, with the business. I mentioned the direct or indirect control of the media.
The state capture, essentially, like the accusations of state capture. One quick question, but because we're nearing the end of our conversation, unfortunately. You've mentioned Peter Magyar. Now, if he wins, do you think that this is going to be a complete 180 on issues such as the support of Ukraine? Or will perhaps the European Union still need to negotiate because some policies might remain similar to the Orbán government?
Yeah, I mean, Peter Magyar is to some extent a black box. We don't necessarily know exactly what to expect of him. Of course, he's presented a program and had some statements on different positions, but his message is mostly being anti or against Fidesz. But I think his stand on the support for Ukraine is still pretty much positioned on public sentiment. He's pragmatic. He's maybe even opportunistic, and as mentioned, the public support for Ukraine and Hungary is relatively low. People don't want to send weapons or money to Ukraine. They're afraid of the war. So here, I think there is still a few question marks on Peter Magyar in that respect. Also, other policies. I mean, Peter Magyar says he's pro-European, pro-NATO, but it does not necessarily mean he aligns 100% of, I don't know, Ursula von der Leyen, for example. We can expect a strong stand on migration policy, so closed-doors policy, the agreement with Mercosur, for example. I think what he will be trying to do is to unlock the funds that were frozen, remain frozen for Hungary over the corruption and breaches of the rule of law. And I think here,
which would be a major milestone. Of course, there are other policies to be discussed there. Unfortunately, I would have to park a conversation here. Maria Skóra was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.